Hello, class. Today I am standing by Stanley Lake. So I'm not standing next to Lake Chad, but I wanted to be sure to stand by a lake in order to talk about Lake Chad and likewise ethical relativism. So today we're looking at a paper on ethical relativism and environmental ethics in terms of global environmental care by Felix Airoboman. And he is a Nigerian philosopher, obviously working out of Nigeria. So Professor Airoboman opens with the basic critique that ethical relativism is ineffectual as a means of accessing and solving sustainability and environmental problems in an age of global concerns that transcend cultural borders and most obviously point to ethical environmental objectivity. Okay, so one of the things that I often tell students is that in environmental ethics, this is one of those cases where the way in which we're understanding global warming and the problems thereof also have incorporated within the structure of our understanding ethically, tied together with ethical objectivity. So for Airoboman, environmental ethics is a means of understanding and protecting the environment and likewise solving problems in the environment. Okay, so Airoboman has as his main concern is with what we call cultural relativism. So the problems of laying claim to the supremacy of any one culture above and beyond the global environment in general. Okay, so in other words, the cultural relativist is perhaps suggesting that there's a way that we're denying ethical objectivity and as a result might claim some sort of ethical superiority over other cultures as Airoboman has it here. And so this notion of transcending cultures takes us back to cosmopolitanism. When we look at the cynics and the cynical call to reestablish humanity within the environment for Airoboman. So cosmopolitanism is a way in which we're understanding interconnection with the cosmos, and in this case, we're extending that to the way in which we understand ourselves in connection with the environment, which is in contrast to the ethically relativist position. Okay, and so one thing you want to note is that there are several types of relativism, ethical or otherwise. So there's epistemic relativism, whereby the relativist calls into question the objectivity of truth or truth claims, then rejects objective truth claims altogether. Okay, so always remember that the relativist, ethical or otherwise, is always rejecting or calling into question objectivity of some kind, and it's in the ethical case, it's ethical objectivity that's getting denied. So number two, there's also subjectivism, which is the extreme form of ethical relativism, whereby the subjectivist sees that there are differences in terms of how it is that individuals regard moral issues. And given these moral differences, the subjectivist then rejects ethical objectivity altogether, okay? Usually not recognizing their own misunderstood observance of ethical objectivity, because an ethically relativist claim is also problematic logically, in the sense that if you're claiming that there are no objective ethics, then that's also a contradictory objective statement. Okay, so then there's what's often termed conventionalism, or cultural relativism, and this is the type that Airoboman focuses on. And it is taken up by the relativists due to the way in which they see that there are perceived differences between cultures in terms of morality, and because of these differences, the conventionalist then rejects ethical objectivity between cultures altogether. Okay. So, as Airoboman points out, according to this theory, then for the relativist, there are no moral absolutes or universals. Rather, the morality or otherwise of an action is relative to cultures. So Airoboman's position is that the relativist is what we sometimes call the conventionalist or the cultural relativist, and this is problematic, right? So what's also linked to this is a supposed tolerance, with the conclusion that is drawn whereby if values and ethics are relative to cultures, we must by extension, for the relativist, tolerate these differences. So once again, according to the ethical relativist, okay? So in other words, the problem of tolerance is such that we say that everyone is different or all societies are different, and because all societies are different, the ethical relativist is thinking then we should tolerate other societies as a result due to those differences. But the problem with that is if you're saying that you need to be tolerant, that in exchange is in contradiction to the ethical relativist's claim because it's logically inconsistent. In other words, if you're saying that everyone should be tolerant, you're also saying that everyone should be objectively tolerant of other cultures. Okay. So part of what gives cause to such claims is the noticeable differences between groups and cultures, say a variance between denominations of Christianity or between religion and politics, etc. And so as far as differences, even as far as differences of opinion between individuals, which is a type of subjectivism. In other words, subjectivism is a type of ethical relativism whereby the subjectivist is claiming that the variance is between individuals to individuals, and because of this variance between or differences between individuals, the ethical relativist or the subjectivist then is claiming that ethical objectivity is to be called into question, okay? So even as far as differences of opinion between individuals, as we just looked at, in terms of subjectivism, which is the individualized form, that's like cultural relativism, okay? So the illustration of common problems, understanding, so this is a problem that we have understanding cases of conventionalism, because if we have a culture or a society in one case, and we have a society and culture in another case, and we have a society and culture in a third case, the relativist is denying that there's ethical objectivity between those, at least the conventionalist is. And what you want to see is that within that, a confusing aspect there is that the relativist is also accounting for a type of ethical objectivity within each culture, okay, that people adhere to. But the relativist is denying the ethical objectivity between those cultures. So then to understanding the nature of environmental ethics, so as we'll recall when we were looking at Desjardins, he pointed out that at the most basic level, environmental ethics is a systemic account of moral relations between us and the environment in which we live. And so important for Airoboman is an emphasis on the environment as intrinsically valuable, okay? So the environment is not just instrumentally valuable as we usually think, okay? So much of what's implied with environmental ethics is our impact on the environment that degrades and depletes natural resources at the environment's expense. And our responsibility is to get a grasp of how to control and grapple with these problems in terms of environmental ethics. In other words, We usually look at the environment in an instrumental way, and when we're looking at it objectively, we also look at it in an intrinsic way. How is the environment valuable in and of itself, in spite of what we can get out of it in terms of resources, okay? So once we identify this, we see that our responsibility is to preserve and conserve the environment for future generations, aka preserving the species and protecting wilderness. Such a call is what we call wilderness ethics, right? The application of normative theories to a specific problem in our environment, and our environmental theories, wilderness theories, environmental theories. And so Airoboman emphasizes the sense that we're working to recognize the objective and intrinsic value of the environment in our relations. So whenever we mention that word value, we're also thinking of ethical value. What's the moral value of the environment? What's the moral value of our relationship with the environment? Is objective as opposed to relativist, okay? So Airoboman emphasizes the sense that we're working to recognize the objective and intrinsic value of the environment in our relationships with it, with a Nigerian reference to moral relations between, with a Nigerian reference to the interconnectedness of humankind and nature. So we have a natural interdependence with nature that needs to be consistently recognized and valued as an objective principle, counter to an ethically relativist claim. So such a view is universal and universally applicable whether we're in Africa or the US. So American Indians or Buddhists. So there's a common universal thread that's shared and recognizable. So let's see what I have here. So basic argument in favor of moral objectivism. I have a philosopher named Louis Poyman that was famous for writing about moral objectivity. And so what we have is the first premise of the argument: objective moral principles are those two which meet the needs and promote the most significant needs of persons. The second premise is some principles are such that adherence to them meets the significant needs of persons. Therefore, his conclusion is, Poyman's conclusion is, therefore, there are some objective moral rules, okay? So Airoboman makes it clear that his engagement with ethical relativism is to see it as counterproductive and is never to be mistaken with objective criteria that's supplanted by the viability of the planet's climate as in terms of the planet's climate, which is as objective as it gets, okay? In terms of the environment and nature in which we live is a way in which we're thinking of our values in terms of morality by way of the environment, and that is objective, okay? So the cultural relativists, on the other hand, see cultures as incommensurable. In other words, there's no way, if you are a relativist, to start finding common ground because you're denying moral objectivity. And when you deny moral objectivity, that becomes an excuse for bad behavior. But likewise, it also becomes a way in which you are not able to work together because you're saying we don't have a common ground that's objective. But in objective, ethical objectivity, we do, because we're noting that there's a common ground. And in this case, the common ground is the environment, right? So yet there's still a common objective when it comes to our responsibility toward nature, okay? So the ethical relativist overplays the difference of agreement to translate this as diametrically opposed. In other words, there's no common ground between both sides. So intrinsically, the virtue ethicist Rosalind Hursthouse points out that we are critical of practices that are different in terms of our cultural practice, but it doesn't mean that it's something that we're tolerant of. In other words, we're intolerant of immorality cross-culturally, okay? So we are critical of the practices of cultures, and such practices do not obviate ethical objectivity. In other words, we might see a culture doing something that's slightly different than ours, but just because it's slightly different doesn't mean that it's so different that we don't have any agreement as far as moral objectivity, okay? So simply because there's a difference doesn't mean that there's something to tolerate. Likewise, environmental practice, radical views easily get us in trouble if we're only suggesting that there's no moral standard that holds, and such practices such as eco-terrorism, et cetera, then become permissible. So Airoboman offers the example of Lake Chad in Africa that borders Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon, which has been reduced by 90% since the 1960s of its water because of the problems in terms of Boko Haram, which is a terrorist group that is also having a part to do with political instability around the lake, and also due to factors related to Lake Chad drying up. So in other words, Lake Chad is drying up due to global warming, but the problems of the drying up also are amplified due to the political instability and also these terrorist groups and people just not getting along due to claims of ethical relativism. So Boko Haram is otherwise known as the Nigerian Taliban. Boko Haram then translates as Western education is forbidden, interestingly enough. And so they existed since the 1970s. In 2004, the group received intercultural condemnation for kidnapping 276 schoolgirls, which sparked an offensive against the group. So nonetheless, Boko Haram still is resilient, bringing conflict to Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. But as an ethical relativist, we could say something like, well, the terrorist group's ideals are not the same as ours, so therefore there's no common ground, which would be a silly idea, because we do look at terrorist groups and say that they're incorrect as far as their views in terms of their treatment of people, namely their treatment of women. Okay. And then so I'm also having you watch a video on Lake Chad, and what we're going to try to do is connect how it is that we have the common ground of objectivity to be found in our efforts to value the environment intrinsically in relation to the conflictual problems that surround Lake Chad and what the associations are to ethical relativism, and how ethical relativism is a problem in contrast to ethical objectivity, because the ethical relativist is denying ethical objectivity. Okay, so thank you and have a fantastic day. We'll talk more later.